Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we are finally going to be taking a look at a brand that so many of you have been asking me to review, Dr. P.H. Martin's Hydrus Liquid Watercolors. We're going to be taking a look not only how they compare to traditional watercolors, but also how they compare to another line from Dr. P.H. Martin, their Bombay India inks, and of course we'll use them in a demonstrational painting. But before we jump into the review, I have a super exciting announcement, and that is that this video has been sponsored by one of my favorite learning platforms, Skillshare. The timing of this video is coincidental, but it has me elated as Skillshare's marketing team actually contacted me about this partnership while I was working on my very own Skillshare class. Although it is completely unrelated and just, like I said, coincidental timing, I am so excited to be able to share this educational resource with all of you if you happen to miss my last video announcing my new class. Most of us have probably already heard the name Skillshare before, but for those of you who haven't, or maybe you're still waiting to take the plunge, let me tell you a little bit about them. Skillshare is an online learning community which at the time that this video is being made has over 23,000 classes in a variety of different subjects including art, design, business, technology, and even more. Skillshare is a membership-based platform, but in return it gives you access to high-quality classes from experts in their field, including some of our very favorite YouTuber family members. Skillshare classes allow you to improve specific skill sets, unlock new opportunities for yourself, and do more of the things that you love to do, whether or not they're for work or for pleasure. Skillshare memberships are very affordable as compared to other similar educational online resources at less than $10 a month billed annually or $15 a month on a month-to-month basis. If you'd like to try Skillshare before committing to a paid membership, they are giving my viewers the opportunity to try a Skillshare premium membership for 2 months completely free for the first 500 people who use the link in the description below this video. In a little bit, we're going to be talking more about the Skillshare class that I personally took to help create this video, but for now, let's go ahead and get back to our Hydrus watercolors. Dr. P.H. Martin's Hydrus watercolors are sold as a liquid, light-fast, transparent medium that promises to deliver the same brilliance and permanency of tube watercolors. According to their website, they can be used in conjunction with traditional watercolors, as well as in other forms such as fountain pens, with dip pens, and in airbrushes. They use mostly standard pigments that we'd recognize from traditional watercolors rather than the dyes that you might find in other lines like their Radiance watercolors, and the Hydrus come in either 1 ounce or half-ounce bottles. Regardless of which size bottles you get, they come in this large, clunky white plastic tray, which I can't show you personally because I threw it out. Sorry, it just took up way too much space. The tray, though, does have some functionality as a palette if you do want to keep yours around. There are small circular wells under each of the color's little dropper handles that you can hold the paint in once you stand the bottles upright. Each bottle has its own eyedropper that you can use to transfer the paint from the bottle to the palette, though there is a bit of a problem with this design for some of the colors. Remember how I said that these paints use traditional pigments instead of dyes? Well, those pigments settle in the solution, and for some of the heavier pigments like the warm red, the brown, and the purple in particular, the pigments actually clog the droppers, making it almost impossible to use them unless you clear it out with something like a toothpick or perhaps maybe a thick embroidery needle maybe. So anyway, I think that's the biggest design flaw with these watercolors, and in conjuncture, I personally just don't like the hassle of having all of these bottles sitting around everywhere, but to each their own, and let's go ahead and take a fair look at the paints, not including the packaging. These paints come in 3 sets of 12 colors, and today we're going to be looking at the colors that come in set 1. The others are called set 2 and set 3. We're going to start at the beginning and take a look at each of the colors as compared to a careful selection of other traditional watercolors in my collection. First up is Hansa Yellow Light, made from PY3. I have to say that I love the Hydrus version of this color. It is so bright and clear and beautiful and luminous. It is so transparent, even more so than Sennelier, which is known for its transparency and lightness. The Hydrus version has just as much punch as the highly pigmented M. Graham version, but has the advantage of being much lighter in its opacity. Next up is their Gamboge, which is a warm yellow, and this one is, well, it's not transparent. It's actually the most opaque of the selection of 3. Despite having an additional red pigment added to the PY65 in this mixture, it actually appears to be the same hue, if not slightly less warm than the Mission Gold's version of PY65. I also pulled Daniel Smith's new Gamboge as another 2-pigment blend carrying the same name, but Daniel Smith's is substantially less opaque, albeit not quite as vibrant as the other 2 options. They call their warm red Brilliant Cadmium Red despite it being a naphtha color, and it's also quite opaque. It's similar to Winsor & Newton's Cadmium Scarlet and American Journey's Poppy with the same pigment number, but it's definitely redder than either of the other 2 as opposed to more orange. Their Deep Red Rose is a lovely cool red, although it is a dual pigment color consisting of 2 cool naphtha reds. I'd call it transparent, although it's not quite as clear as the Da Vinci's PV19, and while it's as deep as Daniel Smith's Carmine, it's a bit cooler in temperature. Their quinacridone magenta is deep and lovely, though this time it's a touch warmer than my favorite version of PR122 from Core. I've also put a swatch of PR202 in here for comparison, but if you want more information on 202 versus 122, you can check out the pigment info in my color spotlight exploring quinacridone magentas. Next up is what Hydrus calls Cobalt Violet, which is confusing for a number of reasons, as it's nowhere near the color of a traditional Cobalt Violet, and there's no pigment information available based on what I could find. Its closest match would be a dioxazine violet, pictured here from M. Graham, but the dioxazine is much more vibrant. Da Vinci has a color called Mauve that has a similar dullness to the overall appearance, but it doesn't get quite as dark as the Hydrus version. Another odd choice is their Ultramarine. I believe that the traditional PB29 doesn't sit well in a liquid suspension like this, so I understand them needing to use other pigments for it. But this combination of PB15 and PV19 create a really deep phthalo blue red shade type of hue, bordering on the darkness of a PB60. It's a pretty color, but definitely not one that should be called Ultramarine in my opinion. Paired with the darker phthalo mixture that we just saw, the cool blue in this set is also another phthalo blue, this time a cool green shade. It's not noted here which version they use for their pigment numbers, but it's definitely a color that has a slight hint of a yellowness in its tints. This set is going to keep those phthalos coming with a phthalo green made from PG7. This one is on par with the hue of Winsor & Newton's version, and I threw it in a Da Vinci swatch just for good measure, but this color really doesn't change much from brand to brand. However, we will be using this one later on in some comparisons, so I have some pretty interesting information coming up on how they behave in washes. Alrighty, we're almost done. Next up we have another mystery color that, like the purple, there is no pigment information for. They call it Venetian Brown, and I pulled a lot of swatches to try and find one that matched for comparison, but none were really spot on. The closest I have are a Caput Mortem from Winsor & Newton made from PR101, and another Winsor & Newton color, a bit of an odd duck. This one is a specialty brown made from a PY164. Since neither of these colors are really common across a lot of different watercolor collections, I went ahead and put in some more common ones like a sepia and a burnt umber so that you could compare them to your paints at home. This set does come with a white, but since we're not going to be looking at that in swatch form, we're going to be wrapping up this parade of colors with their carbon black. It's a deep warm black similar to Mission Gold's version with the same pigment, but this one is noticeably more intense. It's probably most similar in hue to Schmincke's Ivory Black, but the Hydrus version has the benefit of not being made from animal bones if that is something that bothers you. I rounded off this selection of comparisons with a lamp black that is a cooler tone so that you can kind of see the differences here. So I've been sitting on these watercolors for a while, and I thought that the best way to approach this video would be to go ahead and check out Skillshare for another class that might feature this type of paint. I quickly found a class by an artist from Denmark named Camilla. In her class called Demystifying Liquid Watercolors, she used the Ecoline liquid watercolors, but the techniques would apply to the Hydrus as well for my purposes. She started things off with a comparison to traditional watercolors so that we could better understand what the similarities and differences were, and I thought that that would be a good place for us to start as well. I mapped out a grid to compare the PG7 phthalo blue green shade for both liquid watercolors and traditional watercolors, as well as what I imagine to be a very similar pigment, if not the same pigment, in the Bombay India ink line. I'll explain box by box what I did for each test. Some are the same as what Camilla did and some are a little bit different. And then we'll fast forward to the end with a scan so we can compare them all directly together. In this first box, I wanted to see how easy, or not, that it would be to create a flat wash, and right away I encountered a problem that we're going to be talking about with that scan in just a few moments. The second box is a graded wash going from a mass tone on the left to a very light tint on the right, and I wanted to try and get that gradient as smooth as possible. The box underneath that is a wet into wet application, which means I wet the paper first with clear water and then I dropped the pigment into it so that it can kind of disperse and spread on its own. After the wet and wet wash, I did another flat wash, and this time I dropped water into it to check for that cauliflowering or water blooms. Next, I did another flat wash that will eventually be a lifting and glazing test once it dries. For the glazing, I did decide to use a warm yellow from each of the paint's respective lines, meaning for the Hydrus green, I used a Hydrus yellow. For the Daniel Smith, I picked a Daniel Smith, and for the India ink, I used India ink. Finally, the last box is an opacity test with another graded wash so we can check the opacity all along the line. I have to admit this wasn't the best color for this as it is a very transparent color, but we did still glean some information. After I repeated the process with the Bombay India ink and the Daniel Smith watercolor, we are ready for our comparisons. Let's first talk about the elephant in the room because there is a crazy texture going on here with the Hydrus watercolor washes. Phthalo green is not supposed to be a granulating watercolor, but I immediately encountered a textural property, and despite my best efforts, I was not able to compensate for that. What I think is happening here, based on an educated guess and information that I've talked to about other artists over the last couple of months, I think that this is a reaction with my hard tap water here in San Jose, California. I did try to use filtered water to test that theory, but it only slightly improved. I would have liked to try with a bottled or distilled water, but I don't buy bottled water for ecological reasons, so I don't have any on hand to show you. I would love it if you could let me know in the comments down below if you use these paints and have encountered something similar or have not encountered this problem. Let us know kind of what your water situation is, and let's see if we can come up with a consensus on if this is actually what's happening to the pigments. If we move on to some of the other differences, well, both the flat and the graded wash with the Hydrus also weren't graceful or effortless in their applications due to that texture. Both the Daniel Smith watercolor and the Bombay India ink definitely outperformed the Hydrus in that regard. In the wet and wet dispersion test, the traditional watercolor definitely spread the most, but the ink might be better if you want your color to stay in one specific spot. The India ink did have incredible blooms though when we dropped the water into the flat wash, so if you are looking for that effect, I would highly recommend them. And Daniel Smith's had a more fingery appearance. The liquid watercolor did almost nothing in this test except to push those little granulating pigment particles in a small shape of a circle. Despite phthalo green being a staining color on the cotton watercolor paper, the traditional watercolor still lifted off fairly well after the paint was completely dry. The Hydrus lifted somewhat, but definitely put up a fight, and it definitely settled into the grooves of the paper. And if you didn't know already, India inks are absolutely permanent once they dry, and it did not lift even the slightest. The Hydrus does win in one category at least, with the glazing abilities in terms of the sheer vibrancy and clarity. The inks are so transparent that it's hard to glaze a lighter color on top of a darker one, and the watercolors fell somewhere in between. As far as glazing the same color on top of itself and testing opacity, I have to give this round to the Daniel Smith paint. The Hydrus is so pigmented that it leaves behind noticeable deposits over the black line, even though it's a transparent color. And once again, the India ink is so transparent that the additional glazes don't do much in terms of deepening that color. Also notable for the India ink is that in this thicker glazed application, it caused a film and shininess to form. It's really hard to photograph, but it does have a rougher physical texture than either of the other two watercolors, and it's also not as matte as either of the other watercolors in any of these tests across the board. Coming back around to Skillshare, one difference between most YouTube content and the classes that you'll find on Skillshare is that a Skillshare class is just that, a class. The format makes it easier to approach these more difficult or complex class subjects over a wider window of time, while still breaking down each individual concept within the lesson into smaller bite-sized chunks that you can come and go as your schedule requires. Every single class on Skillshare also has a call to action with a class project so that students can implement the skills they just learned in a hands-on way, which is great for kinesthetic and visual learners like me. In Camilla's class, the class project was to create a pair of koi fish using the liquid watercolors and all the techniques we had just learned. It was approachable and well explained, and I chose to freehand my koi, although she did have a template available for students to trace if needed. I also decided in my project that I'd like to paint with the more natural orange and black coloration of koi fish, but she also had a whimsical example that was really fun. I loved painting these flowy fish, and the project was clear enough that even a beginner could pick it up, so I'd highly recommend this class if you want to learn to paint some too. I'm going to go ahead and let the rest of the video play out as you get to watch these pretty little fishies come together, and I hope that this video has provided some useful information about the Hydrus watercolors, as well as introducing you to Skillshare if you weren't already. Thank you so much to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. I was already a paying member, but they have truly made me feel even more welcome over the past month with the program that they have in place for their new teachers to learn about the platform. Don't forget that the free trial link is in the description below, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video. Thank you so much for liking, commenting, and subscribing to the channel if you'd like to see more watercolor content. Thank you so much to my patrons for their unyielding support of what we're doing here, and until next time, happy painting.